It's so nice to meet you. I was communicating with you. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. We're very happy to have you. Thank you so much for your time.
So is anyone else having difficulty hearing or understanding me?
Just the volume, I would find it a bit low, but I don't know whether it's with me or it's with everybody else.
Oh, okay. I think I realized the problem. Okay, there we go. That was the issue.
Yeah. Great.
Sorry. I had switched to these, but I was recording my podcast earlier, so it was still hooked up to my like fancy podcast mic that's like put away up here. So even though my laptop shows that it's using my AirPods, it was still getting that microphone. So okay, that solves that issue. All right. Well, I can get started as soon as we're ready. Should we wait for anyone else or?
No, I don't think so.
I'm just checking for a minute here, but I think that for now that should be the group. Yes, I think it's okay to start. Yes.
Great. So thank you all for coming. My name is Eric Halsey. If you've heard of me, so I'm an American who's lived in Bulgaria for about 10 years now, and I've been making the Bulgarian History podcast for almost 10 years as well. So it's been a very long-standing project. I just released, I think, the 182nd episode today. So it's a very, very long-running podcast that, a little bit to my surprise, has become quite successful. And today I want to talk you through a little bit of what I've learned in how to kind of build a podcast, how to build a community around the podcast, how to monetize it, and then I want to set aside at least a decent chunk of time to answer questions. So, but in the meantime, as I'm talking, if you have a question, you can feel free to kind of jump in, or if you want to write it down and ask later, but it's fine to interrupt. So let me just arrange my notes here. All right. So starting off with kind of thinking about building a podcast. And I think the first thing to kind of consider is who your audience is. I'm lucky to also have a background in marketing, although I started working in marketing at the same time I created the podcast, so I did not know what I was doing at the time. But now I realize that a big part of the success of creating a podcast for me was about being a podcast listener and being able to put myself in the shoes of someone who's listening. So, I've been listening to podcasts since like 2004, 2005 or so. So like way back. And, when I created my podcast, I was trying to address a lot of the issues that I experienced with other, particularly history podcasts. But also I was trying to address some of the gaps I saw in Bulgarian history. So for example, I knew that at the time, particularly, there were very few quality resources on Bulgarian history in English. So I knew that there was a gap that my podcast was filling. I think some of the jokes people have about people starting a podcast is just like, who cares? Like, who are you doing this for? And honestly, a lot of times that's a valid question. You need to think like, who would care about this? Who is this for? Imagine, okay, what kind of person would be listening to your podcast? When would they be listening to it? Is this something that they're going to be super focused on? Or is it something maybe light that they're listening to while they're like doing the dishes at home? Because a lot of those questions are going to help determine the style and the content and how you're producing it. So, for example, one of my frustrations with a lot of history podcasts is that I've always felt like if you kind of stop paying attention or like zone out for 5 seconds, you almost immediately can lose track of what's happening, right? It's like there's a lot of dates, a lot of things, and a lot of the hosts would tend to talk about things as if you like remember everything, like you have perfect memory. They'd bring up a character that they talked about 2 episodes ago, and I'm like, I don't remember who this is. So when I created my podcast, a few of the things that kind of guided me were trying to make sure it was accessible so that even if you weren't a historian or an academic, it was easy enough to follow. So like avoiding some very academic language. And, there's some other history podcasts I've listened to that are very clearly for like PhD students. And I wanted this to be accessible. So I'm thinking about a more general audience. But at the same time, I wanted it to be, let's say, academically rigorous. So I'm not sort of repeating a lot of the nationalistic stories that don't necessarily have a lot of evidence behind them. And I'm being honest about what I know and what I don't know. And that's also been a really nice part in kind of creating my audience and creating my relationship with my audience, is being honest about this thing. We think maybe this happened, but there's a little evidence, but we're not that sure. Or, hey, on this thing, I don't know. I did a bunch of searching. I couldn't find anything. And I've heard from a lot of listeners, they find that refreshing. Because again, even thinking about contrasting myself with other sources on Bulgarian history, a lot of those sources would tend to just be like, this is how it was, very authoritative, acting like everything is clear, everything is known, and not really admitting when things are kind of gray or unclear. So yeah, finishing up, the other thing I was addressing is the fact that Bulgarian history, as most of you probably know, tends to be taught with a large focus on memorizing lots and lots of kind of facts, and not really about narratives and stories and analysis and things like this. So I wanted to contrast it with that as well. So all these things kind of formed the initial idea of the podcast. It would be accessible. It would be kind of honest about what we knew and what we didn't know, and would be for a more casual listener. So otherwise, I'd say I kind of discovered the audience a bit as I went. The honest thing is, like with any, also coming from marketing, with any marketing project, you can start off thinking like, oh, I know my audience is this kind of person who does this and this and this. But the only way you really know that is doing it, actually creating it. And that's another important thing with any podcast, is that you need to be able to adjust as you go, listen to feedback. And that's a big thing for me, that, every time I interact with any listener or thank someone for supporting the podcast, one of the things I put in there is, please let me know if you have any feedback, any criticisms. Like, genuinely, that's important, because one of the tough things about podcasts is that often you have zero feedback, particularly if you're not using a hosting platform that gives you analytics and data about listeners. A lot of, for me, the first year or two creating the podcast, I had zero clue who was listening, how many people were listening, were they enjoying it, what did they like, what they didn't like, no idea. And so when you're creating a podcast, you need to be really proactive and asking people for feedback, so you can take that in and learn who your audience is and improve and adjust how you're creating it to match that audience. So then there's the question of equipment. So equipment is tricky, but the general kind of best practice here, I would say, is get the best quality equipment that you can afford. Because what you don't want to do, which what I kind of ended up doing, but not from my own, basically because of my initial partner on the project, is buy really cheap, kind of not very good equipment, and then go crazy wondering why you think your audio sounds really bad and trying to figure it out, and it just drives you nuts. And then eventually you just buy new, nicer equipment, and you end up spending more money in the long term. So, ultimately I splurged for a very fancy setup. But, for even $100, you can get a pretty good podcasting microphone that will do you just fine. But I would say invest a bit, at least, in some decent equipment, because it'll give you a lot more confidence. You'll feel better about what you're producing, and you won't be sitting there wondering why doesn't this sound good? I tried everything, because that can just drive you insane. Because even as someone who's been doing this for 10 years, audio engineering can be so it's there's ghosts in there. Sometimes just things happen that don't make any sense. And when you have some decent equipment, it kind of removes one variable. There's one fewer thing that's likely causing your problems, and it becomes easier to kind of troubleshoot and figure out what's happening. So otherwise, in terms of kind of equipment and tools and things, good news is for besides a microphone, audio editing, tools I use Audacity. It's a completely free program. It's very capable, and it has all the tools you would need to create a podcast. So there's no need to spend really any money on kind of software for audio editing unless you want to. But stuff out there is free. It's good. That's an easy one. Otherwise, a quick little tip, depending on what kind of podcast you do, obviously if you're doing interviews, it's a little different, but if you're doing a single person narrating like mine, I found that I saved so much time once I realized that every time I make a mistake that I want to edit later, I just pause for 5 to 10 seconds. And so then when I go back to edit, instead of having to listen to the whole episode and find all the mistakes, I can just like scroll through and spot all the big gaps. And every time there's a gap, I know that's where I need to fix something. And it means I can edit a 30-minute episode in like 2 minutes. Like it's so fast and easy since I did that. Again, if you're doing like more complex audio with multiple people talking and things, it's much harder. But to me, that's just this one stupid little thing I came up with one day that has saved me hours of my life. So that's helpful. The other thing is where you record. So one of the big challenges is, creating a quiet environment and an environment without a lot of echoes and things. In the US, a lot of people record in closets, but unfortunately, Bulgaria is a closetless nation. Everyone has garderobe instead of closets, so it's a little harder. But in general, what you want is a space that doesn't have a lot of big blank walls and hopefully isn't too square. But one thing that I found that helped a lot was I actually spent an afternoon and built some sound panels. Actually, I can even just pick one up right here. But you see like this big black thing behind me here? That's a sound panel. So basically, go to the store, get like some pieces of wood and build like a frame out of wood, and then get a piece of rock wool. I can't remember what it's called in Bulgarian, but like stick that in there and then get some fabric, stretch it over it and like staple the fabric tight and hang that on the wall. And basically I made like 4 or 5 of these, hung them up, and like now this room has like no echo. Whereas like a couple months ago, I had to empty this office in order to refinish the floors, and it was so echoey. Like I could have never recorded in here without these panels. But real quick, I'll just pick this up. It's heavy, and you can kind of see the back. So, this kind of big wooden thing filled with this insulation from Bauhaus. But, for probably like 200 leva or something, you could build a couple of those, stick them in a room, and it'll really cut down. You can kind of clap and hear, is there a lot of echo in there? And now there's virtually no echo in here. So that is a fairly straightforward solution to that. Like you can buy specialized like audio absorbing foam and stuff like that from specialty stores, but it tends to be kind of expensive. And ultimately I just went with this and it was easy and cheap and worked very well. So those are kind of all my like basic foundational things about kind of setting up a podcast. So any questions about that step of the process? No? All right, so yeah, getting everything started. I guess you also probably need a website, but that's kind of a whole other issue, kind of building a website and everything like that. I'm not too good at that either, but now we come to the question of community building. So, I'll be honest, to me, I was never very good at community building, mostly because in my mind, to be a really good community builder, you need to be very active, like on Twitter and on Facebook and posting things. And I'm just someone, I don't tweet very much. I don't post on Facebook very much. I joke I'm like a lurker. I like to read and like absorb information, and I'm not out there, giving my opinions all the time. But still, I've managed to build some decent community. And the first thing that I think really just made all the difference in the world in terms of community building for my podcast was the stuff I just talked about, the approach. So, when I started my podcast, I completely expected to get a fair amount of, hate, anger, because Bulgarian history is controversial, right? There's lots and lots of very, very controversial things throughout Bulgarian history. And so I fully expected that on a somewhat regular basis, I would get emails and messages from people saying, how dare you say this? And why did you not say this? And how could you not cover X or Y? And honestly, that's almost never happened in 10 years. And that was shocking to me. And for a while, I wondered, why doesn't this happen? And I mean, I think part of it is maybe just if people get upset, they just don't listen to the podcast and they don't bother reaching out to me. But I think a lot of it, and particularly in meeting so many podcast listeners of mine over the years, is that the way I approach it kind of draws a specific audience. So because I'm not approaching it from a kind of rah-rah nationalistic, kind of approach, because I'm very thoughtful and being honest about, again, what we know, what we don't know, all these kinds of things, that I think approach is very attractive to a very specific kind of listener. And so, for example, in my podcast, I covered, the Ottoman period of Bulgarian history in just as much detail as any other period. And my thinking was, Bulgaria was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Bulgarians were in the Ottoman armies. So even when the Ottomans were off fighting in Persia or something, those armies for the most part contained Bulgarians. So covering the Ottoman Empire's history was also covering Bulgaria's history, because, what happened to the empire happened to Bulgaria because it was a part of it and Bulgarians were involved. And eventually one listener did reach out and say, hey, why are you covering the Ottoman period in so much detail? Could we maybe move it along, go a bit quicker here? And I said, okay. I explained my thinking, but I decided to poll my listeners and say, hey, what do you all think? Should I speed it up? Because I could speed it up a little bit. Or do you like the fact that I'm covering it in this detail? And overwhelmingly, the vote was, no, keep covering it in this detail. And that original listener, when I told him this, he said, oh, great. Okay, that's what the listeners want. Then by all means, continue as you're doing it. And I was just shocked. It was like everyone at every step of this was so nice, was, being very honest about what they preferred, what they didn't prefer, and understanding of my decisions. So, experiences like that to me really spoke to how much my community was shaped by my own approach. And it's just made me so grateful, because honestly, at this point, I have made so many friends through the podcast. A lot of my really, really good friends are people I met through the podcast. And I regularly meet up with listeners when I'm traveling abroad or when they're coming to Bulgaria. And almost without fail, those are just wonderful interactions, and they're really nice people. So to me, one of the nice things about community building and podcasts is a little bit you get what you put out. If you create something out of a real labor of love, and it's clear that you care about it and that you're putting a lot into it, and if you do manage to build a community around that, you'll probably build a really great community of people who kind of reciprocate that same energy, that same style that you put in. And honestly, that's the most rewarding thing about doing a podcast to me, is those kinds of connections of people you meet and the community that you build. That's it. Getting some more practical elements of community building. There's kind of the theory, the idea about it. I did create a Facebook page, and I decided kind of the main place where people can post things, ask questions, where I'll post, if I find something cool and interesting connected with Bulgarian history, I'll usually share it there. And it's not super, super active. I've got a decent number of followers on it, but it's a nice little place where I do get some feedback and people sharing interesting things. And I try to point people to that at the end of every episode. So, if you do have a place for community, it's nice either at the beginning or the end of each episode, just to remind people that's where it is. And I'll talk a bit more about kind of how to start and how to put those reminders in a little later. But, every time I try to remind people, hey, we've got a Facebook page, you can check it out. And that's where I'll post other interesting things. Otherwise, the only other kind of community place I have is Patreon. But I also don't tend to use Patreon as that much of a kind of community space. I know a lot of podcasts have things like private Discord servers and things, but for me, I just feel like I haven't had the time. That, creating the podcast already takes a lot of my time. It's a huge portion of my weekends. And so personally, I decided to kind of limit some of those community elements, just because already a lot of the interactions I get, people have very detailed questions, and I try to always answer them. But people will ask, oh, what do you think about this thing? And me answering that question requires looking to a lot of books and things. So just for my own time, I decided to kind of keep Facebook as the primary location for that community. But I think for a lot of people, having a kind of private community for special supporters or donors or patrons or something can be a really nice way to create a special zone, a special place for community building. But besides that, I think, so I had a little trouble here dividing community building and monetization, because to me, they're very, very closely intertwined. So I'm going to kind of start to move into monetization as I continue to talk about community building, because they just sort of blend into one another. But one place where I do both those things is whenever someone does become a patron, I give them a shout out. And I mentioned I meet a lot of listeners and things. I also tend to give them shout outs as well. And that's a part of, again, creating the whole vibe of the podcast. And what it is, it's a kind of labor of love for me. I'm basically the only person involved. My wife helps me a little bit with some translation of sources and things, but otherwise, like the writing, the editing, the recording, everything is just me. And so, when I open each episode and things, I'll say thank you by name to all the people who were supporting the episode, all the new people, but also like, hey, this person, it was really great grabbing a beer with you in Sofia the other week. Thanks so much for that. And I think having those little shout outs, those little mentions, it's a nice way to kind of remind the audience that like, this is just me. I'm just a person. And also that I do like meeting up with you all. It's a nice reminder to people to get in touch with me if they'd like to meet if they're in Sofia or something like that. And I think that has really created a very specific vibe and made me as the host more approachable. And so, nowadays I probably get an email from a listener maybe 2 times a month. Someone reaches out about something. So, pretty regular interactions with listeners and things. And that was kind of a conscious decision on my part to make it, some more official podcasts, particularly ones created by, organizations, companies, or, like National Public Radio in the US, something like that. They feel extremely polished and official. And while I want polished in the sense of like the audio quality, the production is good on my podcast, I wanted consciously for it to sound like something that a person created because they love this topic, not like an organization is behind this. So a little bit of how I address that, ties into community building and monetizing it. Because also when I mention those new patrons and things, it's a good chance to just remind everyone, hey, you can support the show on Patreon or donate via PayPal. Because some people don't like Patreon for political reasons. So it's nice to give 2 ways to support the show. Now, honestly, talking more specifically about monetization, the podcast has ultimately become really successful in that realm, and that surprised me. I absolutely never thought this podcast would be a thing that makes money. For the first couple of years, it very much lost money because I had to pay for equipment and for hosting, and there's a lot of initial expenses, let alone my time. And so I think a little bit approaching it not as something that I was really focused on monetizing helped a bit. And that it didn't, I've heard listeners say that it's nice that it doesn't sound like I'm constantly asking them for money and that like, oh, I need the money. They appreciate, I think, that in the way I approach the show, the money sounds like, and it is kind of a secondary thing. It's like, if you can support the show, that's amazing. If you can't, that's fine. I'm glad you're enjoying it. This kind of an approach where I'm not judging anyone. You're welcome to support if you can, but I'm just sort of the vibe of like, hey, I'm just glad you're listening. And even when someone stops being a supporter, I try to remember to reach out to them and say, thank you so much for all the support you've given up until now. I hope you're doing well. Hope everything's okay. And, all the best. I hope you continue to enjoy the show. And it's a nice opportunity first to see why they might be stopping supporting the show. Like if they're mad about something, they didn't like something, I want to know. I mentioned, it's hard to get feedback when you're doing a podcast. So that's a good opportunity to listen. But, for some people, particularly during the COVID-19 period, they lost their jobs, their finances were hard hit and things. And it was a good opportunity for them to, some people would write back saying, hey, I wish I could keep supporting, but, I don't have a lot of money these days and everything. And for me to say, oh, well, I really hope things get better for you, but thank you so much even for what you've done and, wishing you all the best, is a good opportunity to make that choice, even to stop supporting the show, emotionally feel good. Because you can imagine, if you've been supporting a show for a while and you no longer can, maybe you feel guilty about that. And now when you listen to the show, you think, oh, I feel bad that I'm not supporting him anymore. You could start to have some negative emotions tied in with that show. But for me, it's like, I don't want that. I don't want people to have negative emotions tied with my show. I want them to feel good about it. whether they're supporting or not. So kind of thinking about, again, putting myself in the shoes of someone who might be supporting and what they might be feeling, what their experience might be, and trying to make sure they have just a nice experience throughout. So that's one of those little things that can help once you start monetizing. But as I said, I was surprised that the show basically became financially successful. But ultimately, once I heard more about Patreon, I decided that was the best way to go. For a while, I considered advertising, trying to find some people who would like to put ads on the show. I spent a lot of time trying to investigate that, talking to some platforms and things. I've gotten offers over the years to join some podcasting networks. There's a lot of ways to approach that. Ultimately, though, I decided that, again, thinking about the vibe I was creating with my podcast, that advertising didn't really make a lot of sense. First of all, I, pretty quickly after starting Patreon, within a year or two, was making more than I would if I were advertising. And, if I was going to advertise, I'd probably need to create an ad-free version of the show to give to people who were supporting on Patreon. And that's just a whole headache of like, you got to pay for more hosting. And now your analytics are divided between 2 different RSS feeds. And so it's harder for you to see total listener numbers. And it just it adds more cost and makes things more expensive. You need to maintain those advertiser relationships. You need to make sure you're paying for a good quality hosting service that's giving you analytics, because any advertiser is going to want to know how many people are listening, what countries are they in. So just, at least from my experience, advertising basically created a lot more problems than it solved. And I ultimately decided, you know what, in any case, again, this is a labor of love. The goal of this was never to make money. And if there are ads in it, it sounds more like something that I'm trying to really focusing on making money off of. Whereas it just felt better for me, and it felt more in line with the whole vibe and ethos of the show to say that, this is completely free, no ads. It's only supported by people who want to support it. And it's going to be free forever. And I want it to be out there and available and free forever. So that was my thinking. But that said, if you do want to look at advertising, you've got to get to at least a certain, amount of listenership. But there are more options for that than ever before, right? Because podcasting has become so big. In particular, now there's a lot of automated systems that will insert ads based on listeners and things. I had this very weird, a lot of my podcasts I listen to, because I'm in Bulgaria, I get no ads because Bulgaria is not a big ad market and no one cares enough to advertise to Bulgarians. But if I travel to another country and then download new episodes while I'm there and come back, there are times I listen to an episode and all of a sudden I'm hearing an ad in Italian and I'm momentarily like, what is happening? And then I realize, oh, they have an automated system for inserting ads, and it detected I was in Italy, and so it gave me an Italian ad. So anyways, but there are good options for that if you are interested. But, I would say one of the important ways to approach something like a podcast is to go value first. And this is, again, a thing I kind of take from my advertising career. It's best not to immediately ask for something from someone before you've given them something, right? So, if I'm immediately from the very beginning of the podcast saying, hey, I want you to give me money, so I'll do this and it creates a different tone, right? It creates a different relationship from the start. But, if on the other hand, it's like you can go there, you can see I've created all these episodes, and it's clear that I'm not pushing Patreon and constantly asking people for money. That's a very secondary thing. I'm putting value first. And so all that to say, if you are starting a podcast, probably you wouldn't want to start asking for donations or asking about advertising or anything right from the beginning. Start just creating something that's of high quality and get people to listen, build an audience, show that you are, primarily interested in creating something good, and that down the line, you'd like to get some financial support to help make that happen. But, showing your audience that your main focus is producing great content for them and not asking them for support, I think is important if you're going to create a good relationship with your audience. Now, when it came to actually like practically kind of monetizing and creating a Patreon, the big question I had was you want to give your supporters something. And so I had to face the question of what bonuses, what extras could I give them? Now, this is going to vary. Some people like physical stuff, but unless you're doing a podcast that's, you know, in Bulgaria for people in Bulgaria largely, it's kind of difficult with shipping and things to get people anything physical. So it's really best to go with digital benefits. So for me, I created like a special mini series about the history of Bansko, knowing that a lot of people interested in Bulgaria tend to go there. I created a special episode about the history of Bulgaria and the Crusades. And that was actually a kind of side benefit because I was asked by a university in the US to give a lecture on that topic. And I basically asked if it was okay. And then after I gave the lecture, I took my notes and recorded it as a podcast episode and gave it as a benefit for my patrons. So sometimes if you're looking out, you can spot interesting little opportunities to take something you were using for something else and turn it into a nice little benefit for your patrons. Another thing I do is I give them access to all the transcripts. So I've got like a giant Google Doc with a list of all the episode transcripts. So, you know, particularly if someone's, you know, really into the podcast, it's obviously nice to be able to see and read what each episode is about. It's a little easier to maybe follow. So I offer that as a benefit. But tying back in with community building, the other two benefits I've offered on my Patreon are a tour of Sofia. So again, a lot of my listeners can't take advantage of this because they're not in Bulgaria, but it's nice to give that offer and that, hey, you know, if you're coming to Sofia, I'd be happy to give you a history tour, to show you around and tell you about the history of the city. It's something genuinely it's fun. I like to do, but again, it kind of reinforces that impression of the podcast I want to create, that this is a labor of love, that if you're supporting the show, hey, I'd love to meet you in person and like show you around. You know, it's a nice, special kind of experience for people. And it's a little above and beyond what you get from most podcasts, right? Where it doesn't feel like it's a person you would meet, right? The host or something is like they're off doing their thing and you're just a humble listener. But, you know, it helps make it feel like this podcast is accessible and it's something that you can, you know, be a part of, interact with if you'd like. So, So I kind of mentioned before, but, you know, the only way I really mention Patreon, the only way I promote it is just mentioning very quickly at the beginning of every episode, hey, you know, if you can, I'd love it if you supported the show on Patreon. And if there's new patrons between the last episode and this one, I'll say their names real quick, but that's it. And I actually later on heard a different podcast creator specifically call me out in a blog post and compliment the way I approach that he liked that a lot more than shows that, you know, go on and on about, oh, you should support us and, oh, it doesn't cost that much and here's what you could get. And just that, because it was a very brief kind of mention, first it meant it's not really skippable. Like it doesn't make sense to skip because it's just a few seconds. You would skip actual content if you tried to skip it. Whereas, yeah, if there's like a long ad read, I mean, I'm guilty of it too. It's easy just to hit the skip button and move past it. So it's super fast. It doesn't kind of take anything away. It doesn't feel like I'm asking for a lot of time from the listeners to listen to my whole spiel about how they should support the podcast. It's just quick, hey, love that you supported, but even if you can't, thank you for listening. Anyways, let's get into it. You know, just a few seconds. And I think there are real benefits to that. So maybe the first time, if you've been creating the show for a little while and you're creating a Patreon for the first time, that's a good chance to say, hey, you know, here's why I'm doing this. Here are the different benefits you can get. Here's, you know, why you might consider supporting it. You know, talk about it that time. But afterwards, for the most part, I would suggest just keeping it pretty brief. And if someone is interested in supporting, they'll hop on Patreon and they'll be able to see what benefits you offer and, you know, all the reasons and the ways they can support the show. But you don't need to kind of hammer them over the head about it every single episode. Now, I think it's also useful to remind listeners what you do with the support. Again, not spending too long, but, you know, for example, any of you who have ever bought like or needed to look at academic history books, you know, there's popular history books that tend to be quite affordable, but like niche academic books can cost a fortune. Like I've got this book I bought last time I was in the States about like kind of oral history of Bulgarian Jews in the Holocaust. This book was like almost $100. Like it was very expensive because it's supposed to be purchased by like university libraries. Like it's not a book that's supposed to be bought by regular people. But when I do, drop an obscene amount of money on a bunch of these like out of print or like niche academic historical books so I can use them for the podcast, I like to kind of shout it out and thank my patrons. Like, oh, thank you all so much. You enable me to utterly shamelessly spend way too much money on all these hard to find books. But, I can easily drop $100 on a book because you all support me. And then I can use that book to make an even better show for you. So it's a bit fun, it's a bit cheeky. Like, thank you for, enabling me to shamelessly spend money on books. But it's just a reminder of like what that support practically means. And yeah, it's just a little bit of fun. It's nice for people to know what the money that they're giving you is going towards. Now, just looking through my notes here. So yeah, another thing about monetization and community building, I mentioned whenever someone supports the show, I send them an email with a link to all the benefits that they get to download the special episodes and things. But as I said, I also ask them for feedback, positive, negative, just ideas, whatever they think. And that's something I also, particularly when I get to more controversial or difficult topics, it's something that I try to incorporate into the show. So I'll talk about, hey, here's from all the research I've done, all the books I've read, here's my take on this particular topic. But again, this is super complicated. There's a lot to go here. And if you disagree with me, let me know, reach out, and a lot of people have done that over the years. And honestly, they've been incredibly useful. And I've done spent 15, 20 minutes sometimes on a podcast just addressing and talking about some of the stuff that listeners had sent me, where they said, you talked about this topic this way, but I think you maybe left this out and maybe created the impression of X and Y. And so I'll say, hey, listener, Ivan reached out and shared this kind of information with me and pointed out that because I covered this topic this way, you might have had this impression, but he made some really good points here. And it's a good opportunity both to just provide good analysis and I think it makes me better. And oftentimes they're correct. Usually I agree with their criticisms of me. Oh, you're right. I kind of did miss this point, or I might have misled about this thing. But it's another reminder to my listeners that, hey, this is a community. And if you have an opinion about something and you reach out to me, I will read it and I will take what you say very seriously. And I might even devote a whole chunk of an episode to kind of talking through it. So I think, again, that approach of just being very open, being very honest, in always inviting input and feedback and just showing that in the way I create the shows, again, just sets the right tone. It sets the right vibe for the show. And I think it's really gone a long way towards creating a kind of community that's really positive, very supportive, and that just everyone wants the show to be better instead of just coming in like, why didn't you do this? I'm so mad. You suck, blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Another quick thing is when I do get new patrons, when people support the show, I could easily automate the process of emailing them with their benefits. But to me, that feels also too impersonal. So even though sometimes I'm super busy and it takes me 2 weeks to email someone with the stuff that they got for supporting the show, I always do it myself. And I always type out those messages by hand. And whenever I know something about the person, sometimes they might send me a message. I try to be personal about it instead of just, kind of boilerplate cookie cut. Everyone gets the same, canned message. And so I think, again, that makes people feel when they're supporting the show that, this isn't just some automated process. They just get an email like they're subscribing to a newsletter at a website or something. It's me actually reaching out and saying, hey, so-and-so, thank you so much for your support. And let me know what you think, all that kind of stuff. All that stuff. So it's another just small thing. And even honestly, when I say, hey, I'm really sorry it took me 2 weeks to email you with this, I've been completely slammed, but thank you. it shows that like, this is actually me. I'm a real human being and I'm actually emailing you. Now, just looking at my list. Yeah, so I think those are all the main points I kind of wanted to make here about how I've approached creating the podcast, how I've monetized it, how I've created a community. I guess kind of wrapping up before switching over to questions, we probably got the main idea here is that to a great extent, when it comes to podcasts, you get back what you put in. And that if you really show caring, humility, admitting when you make a mistake, pointing out that you're trying your best, but you're going to make mistakes inevitably, and you'd appreciate if people could let you know so you could make this better for everyone. Just taking that kind of approach, I think really helps make it easier to build a community that's positive and caring, and that will really help you make a better show. And just it makes the whole thing a lot more pleasant. As I said, I mean, if I was actually getting regular hate mail and people writing me angry messages or whatever, maybe I would have stopped doing this podcast years ago. But for me, because I've had just such overwhelmingly positive experiences with my listeners, and I say sometimes like how lucky I feel that, because this is, it's not my full-time job, it's a very much a part-time thing, but it's part of how I earn a living and what I do. And so few people in the world get to do a job where you regularly hear from people who reach out and say, thank you so much for doing this. Particularly for me, hearing from people with maybe Bulgarian parents who grew up abroad or who moved away from Bulgaria as a small child, or they are married to a Bulgarian. Like, I hear so many of these stories of people saying, this podcast enabled me to connect with that part of my history or my partner's history or my parents' history. It just feels great. And being able to create something that is meaningful to people and that people let you know how meaningful it is, to me, that's just a recipe for being happier in your life and feeling much more fulfilled. And that's a hard thing to do with a lot of ways that most of us make a living. And so in general, to me, that's one of the great things about creating a podcast that manages to be successful, is that you do get that kind of feedback and you're creating something that people really care about. And above monetization or community building or whatever, like, that's to me the most important thing. That's the best thing that's come out of the show, is just knowing that I've helped people in a lot of ways and help people kind of connect with parts of their lives that otherwise they didn't feel so connected to. So with that, I will wrap up and switch over to any questions you all might have.
Hello there. I have a more of a technical type of question.
Mm-hmm.
What type of microphones do you use, and how did you choose the right microphone for you?
So I mentioned, so right when I started, I started creating the podcast with a friend of mine who went ahead and just got a used microphone without even asking me. And we had to buy a little soundboard, and the audio was terrible and it drove me crazy. And so by the time I was going to actually invest in my own equipment, I decided I wanted to get really, really good stuff. So I use, see here, a Shure SM7B. This is a really very top of the line microphone. I think it's maybe $400 or something. Yeah. So this is what a lot, like Mark Maron, a lot of top podcasters, I think Joe Rogan, they all use this microphone. So when I ultimately went with that, it was you know what? I will spend whatever money. I just want a microphone I know is good. I know it's not going to be the source of endless frustration. It's like if you, I don't know, if your bicycle, you buy a bicycle and your bike is always giving you problems and just drives you insane. Once you buy a new bike, you're like, I want a good one. I do not want to repeat that experience. So that drove me towards this. So I have a Shure SM7B, but because of the type of microphone this is, the two types of mics you have are, I think XLR is the connection type, or USB. USB, you just plug it into your computer, record, super easy. For most podcasters, a USB microphone is all you need. It's just much, much simpler. These nicer ones that are more from the professional audio world, these have, let's see, I disconnect this thing. This kind of an XLR connection, if you've ever been in a band or something like this, these are connections that you use. And as a result, this has to go through an amplifier. And because of the type of mic it is, it also needs a preamp. So like there's like 4 bits of kit. You know, basically it's this, a Shure SI2, I think, is the thing it goes into, and then a Cloud Lifter preamp. But you know, all told, this is probably like a $600-700 setup. Like I'm lucky because I also do voice acting, and so like I use it to record commercials and things like that. I recorded, if you've been on the new Sofia Metro line, I did the English language announcements there. So like I recorded all that on this gear. So, you know, I could justify spending a lot of money because I also earn money through it in other ways outside of the podcast. But yeah, I went for like a very professional top of the line setup.
And do you do any post-processing of the audio, of the podcast?
Yes. So after I record, I do 4 things, I think. So first thing I do, every podcast episode, I start off with a good 10 seconds or so of silence. So I mentioned I use Audacity. If you have a period of silence, you can select that and you can create, I'm trying to remember the terminology they use, but create like a profile of the silence, and then you can use that to remove background noise. So obviously, like if someone in the background like claps or something, you can't really easily remove that. But if you have any background noise that's kind of low and consistent, then basically Audacity can remove that. So what you're doing is you're taking that silence and you're telling Audacity, anything you hear during this period of silence, remove that from the whole audio track. And so if there is any background noise, that should get removed that way. Then I do some like an EQ processing. So I kind of bump up the levels. If you're curious, I can send you like a little video clip that shows exactly all the steps and all the levels I do, because a friend who's a better audio engineer than me set all this up for me years ago, and I just do the same process every time without knowing exactly the details of it. But so I remove background noise, I adjust the EQ levels, and then I do some compression. And basically, yeah, that turns okay, not so great audio that comes out of this into really nice sounding audio.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask something, because I understand what you say about this being like a child of love and the advertisement is not really the point. But have you ever like used, I don't know, Facebook advertisement or some kind of paid advertisement in your post or something? That's my first question. I have another one.
Yeah, so I never have, you know, despite the fact that, again, I do work in marketing and things, and like I'm more of a writer. My colleagues work on those ads and things, but to me, it's like I could, maybe I should try it, but I have in my jobs in the past had to like run Facebook ads things, and I just don't like it. I just do not like running ads. I don't enjoy the process and everything. And, you know, the cost, the pure cost benefit analysis is a bit unclear. You know, I'd have to do some math to see whether it'd be worth it for me to kind of advertise that way. I would say, like, you know, particularly if you're getting started at the beginning, I think that could be a good way to make people aware of your show. You know, at this point, it's like, I think if you Google Bulgarian history, like my podcast shows up on the first page of results, and I've been around for like almost 10 years. So I'm at the point where like, I don't really need to advertise. And I always say, like, if someone's looking for my podcast, they'll find it right away. I find it funny. People always ask me when they hear about the podcast, like, oh, where can I find it? How can I find it? And like, if you Google Bulgarian history podcast, like I'm the only one. Like it's very easy to find it once you're looking for it. But actually, a thing I didn't mention, but probably should have, is one of the other great ways to promote a podcast, particularly early on, is what's called cross promotion. So, you know, basically find a podcast that you think would have a similar audience to yours, and, you know, reach out to the person who creates it and see if they'd be interested in exchanging an intro. So basically, when you do that, it's like I record an intro for their podcast and they record an intro for mine, and we each insert it into our respective podcasts, and each of us gets to, you know, plug our own show. So for example, I did this with Robin Pearson's History of Byzantium podcast, because we cover a lot of the same stuff. And, you know, I still, like, literally 20 minutes before I came on to talk to you all, I got an email from someone who's a patron who's been listening for years, who originally heard about the show because he listened to that podcast. And I've heard that a lot. So yeah, it can be difficult to find the right shows and to find someone who's willing to do it, particularly if you're just getting started. But I think that is one of the like top best, most cost efficient ways to promote your podcast, get yourself out there, and also meet other podcasters. And they can be useful for asking questions and getting insights as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think that this answered also my other question, because I looked at your Facebook page and I see that you post also a lot like of sources, a lot of other information and articles. And I've always wondered about that, because sometimes it's very important. I mean, there are very different opinions on that you should focus on your real content and not like advertise additional sources. But it's your thing. I think it's working in what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's helpful because I'm the kind of person who, if I wasn't making my podcast, I would want to listen to it. And so like the kind of other stuff I share on that is like an article about some archaeological discovery in Bulgaria. Or recently I discovered that a museum in Chicago is doing a big exhibition on the Thracians. And so I shouted that out at the podcast. I was like, hey, I just heard that if you live around Chicago, this museum's doing a cool thing connected with Bulgarian history. You should go check it out if you can. And actually, I can't make it to Chicago, but like if you do go, reach out to me. Let me know what you thought of it, because I'd love to hear what it was like. So it's like I'm not promoting my own stuff. Again, it shows that labor of love. It's just, hey, I think this is cool, and I think you all might enjoy this as well. So here it is. Check it out. So yeah, that's been kind of my approach, is just thinking, what do I genuinely think my audience would find cool and interesting, and trying to just share that stuff with them.
Thank you.
Okay.
And,
sorry.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask also about your patrons. As long as I understand, most of them are not based in Bulgaria, yes?
Yeah, I think so.
Curiosity. Okay.
Yeah, I think a large the largest portion of my audience is actually from the US. And like just in my interactions with listeners over the years, I feel like a large portion of my listeners are what I described before: people from a Bulgarian background in the US, people who are friends or partners with someone of a Bulgarian background in the US, and then a smaller portion of people who just like history. Like the person I heard from earlier, he got interested in the Ottoman Empire, and from the Ottoman Empire, he got interested in the Byzantine Empire, started listening to the Byzantine History podcast, heard about my podcast through that, started listening to my podcast. So, sometimes just history lovers, but again, thinking about hearing how people found your podcast is really useful, and kind of going, oh, okay, I see how that chain happened. And then thinking about, okay, if there's another person like them who maybe didn't listen to the Byzantine History podcast, how could I get in front of them? How could I make them aware of my show? Someone else had a question, I think.
So I guess, now it's my turn. What type of rewards do you give to your patrons?
So I mentioned there's like a history of Bansko miniseries, access to all the episode transcripts, a special episode on the Crusades in Bulgaria. And then I offer, if they're ever in Sofia, to give them like a walking history tour. And the top level, I also said, is like, if you're ever in Bulgaria, I'll cook you a meal, because I love cooking. And and so like,
that's great.
I've only done that for a few patrons, but it's another like nice personal thing. Like genuinely, if you contribute this amount of money, if you're ever in Sofia, you're welcome at my place. I will cook you a delicious meal and like host you and everything. So I think that also,
pretty cool.
Yeah, it sets that vibe of this is not so corporate or something.
Do you think that it's advisable for a smaller podcast which cannot provide so much additional content to create a Buy Me a Coffee? This website, right?
Yeah.
Do you think it will work, or?
I mean, it could be worth.
Yeah, it will be worth trying. Yeah, that's the basic question.
So I think like the big difference is like why people do support. It's like thinking about your audience. Do you think if they're supporting your show financially, are they doing it because they think your show is great and they want to support it, and like what they get back is just a cool bonus? Or is it, I really want these extra benefits, therefore I'm going to support? Which of those two things is the thing that's actually drawing them in? So for my show, I'm pretty sure it's more like they just want to support it. And like, I spent years trying to think of like better, cooler Patreon benefits, but like I just can't think of anything else.
Yeah, that's a problem with me too. Like,
yeah, for some things it's like, but you could be honest about that. Just say like, hey, I've been thinking about how to, create some extra benefits that you all could get if you financially support me, but I'm really having a hard time coming up with some. So, for now, I'm setting up this buy me a coffee. But like, if any of you have an idea of something you think you could get from me that would be cool, like reach out, let me know. I'd love to hear your ideas. So again, it's at being honest, being kind of humble, and letting them know, like, I'm figuring this out. I'm trying to find the best way to go about this.
Yeah.
And I think if you act that way, it's like people give you the benefit of the doubt, right? They're going to be a lot kinder in their judgment, and not like, well, he wants me to give him money, like he's not going to give me, If you explain your thinking, then they'll probably feel differently about it. So, just come and say, hey, I'm experimenting. I'm trying to figure this out. So I'm going to try this buy me a coffee thing, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, brainstorm with them together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? I'm curious then, if any of you have podcasts, like what are your podcasts about?
Okay, so I'm participating in two podcasts. One of them is more like the target group is like 25 to 35 or 20 to 35, like the younger generation. And actually at the moment we did a rebrand, and now we try to invite more recognizable people to our podcasts, our guests, like actors here in Bulgaria or radio hosts or stuff like that. That's
so it's kind of like a talk show.
Yeah, it's more like a talk show. We try to keep it as far as possible from an interview because we want to make a podcast, not an interview.
Yeah.
But sometimes we click with the guest and it goes really well. So yeah, that's the concept for now. And the other podcast is I do it together with Alexander Kumanov, which is right next to me somewhere on one of the windows. Yeah. And it's more like an older audience, like 35 to, I don't know, Kumanov, 70?
44.
Okay.
Mainly it's between 30 and 44.
Okay. Yeah. And there I'm more like a technician, like I watch out for the cameras and microphones and stuff like that. But sometimes I participate. And
actually,
it's called Pets to Tinky or 5 cents. If you want to translate it. And the main concept is to get every guest 5 cents at the end of the podcast.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a thing I should have talked about also, is a question of whether to put your podcast on YouTube as well.
Oh, yeah.
So this is another thing people have asked me why, like, oh, why don't you put your show on YouTube? And like, I never have, because mostly like, it's just me recording here. There isn't much interesting to look at me just like talking to a microphone. So, again, thinking about like what extra value would it be providing? Now, granted, if I did put my show on YouTube, that would be another potential place to monetize, if it does well enough, that is. But, for me, it's been like, I don't really have the time. I'm not as interested in doing that. But the nice thing is also, particularly if it's a show like mine, which isn't super time related, like it's kind of an evergreen, that I could, at any point just put all my episodes up on YouTube and put some visuals with them and things. And there's nothing stopping me. So I thought that's like in the back of my head, maybe one day if I have the time, I'll do it. But, for now, I decided like there wasn't enough extra value for my audience that I felt like would be added. Plus, famously, YouTube comment sections are horrendous. And I mentioned what a nice audience I've managed to build. And I know if I go on YouTube, I will just get the worst garbage comments from yeah, exactly. And it's just like, I don't need that stress in my life. So
it's really time consuming. Yeah, I gotta agree. Both podcasts I do need have a video, and the first one has 3 cameras, so I have to montage with multicam, and it's like it's really time consuming.
Yeah. All right. Any final questions? Well, if any of you do have any questions down the line, you can feel free to reach out to me. You can, find me on Facebook or whatever, just to send me a message or something. If you're curious, if you do send me a friend request on Facebook to ask me a question, though, like write me a message as well, because like I get random friend requests from people who like I don't know who they are. And if they don't send me a message like introducing themselves, then I usually just ignore it because like I don't know this person. So yeah, down the line, anything you think I could help with, feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to help.
Great.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this.
Thank you so much for your time. It was amazing. Do you maybe have a minute only to stay with us, with me and Sasha, just after?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Costa, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say thank you as well.
Cool. You're welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you, Costa. Our wish is to have a minute with you after we've all finished. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.